All right. Good morning, Doug. Today, I'd like to talk about Bitcoin. Bitcoin hit an all-time high overnight. It's currently trading at 51,300 and something. And the big question is, and people are starting to talk about this more intently now, is Bitcoin in a bubble? What do you think?
Yeah, yeah, okay. Well, I guess we've talked about some of the fundamentals of Bitcoin in the past, and perhaps it's worth touching on them again. So you know much more about Bitcoin itself than I do. You've actually mined it, and you've got a lot more Bitcoins than I do. I mean, I just started dipping my foot in the water back in 2017 in July when and I guess this is important to review. Uh, Early in the days of Bitcoin, and I'd heard about it back in, I don't know, 2012 or something like that, when a Belgian guy gave me a physical Bitcoin, which existed back then. I still have it today, and I haven't turned that into the ether. It's still the physical thing. I guess it's got the codes
Right.
written around or something, so I could do that. So it's amazing. I bought him lunch. He gave me a Bitcoin, so I got something in my safe deposit box worth $51,000 today. That's amazing. Anyway, so why didn't? So he made this Belgian guy. His name was Tour de Meester. He made the case for Bitcoin back then, but I didn't get it. And the reason I didn't get it and why I didn't think it had value back then is I looked at the characteristics of a good money. It's got to be durable. Okay, it's durable as long as the internet's up. Internet collapses, civilization collapses. Okay, so it's plenty durable, divisible. Yeah, infinitely divisible. It's a mathematical concept. Convenient. Yeah, everybody's got a cell phone today. Yeah, it's pretty convenient now. Consistent. Yeah, every Bitcoin is exactly like every other Bitcoin. But value, use value in itself. And I couldn't figure that out. And nobody pointed it out to me. And when I went to a conference in Aspen, where I was a speaker actually on Bitcoin, kind of odd to have somebody who doesn't believe in Bitcoin be a speaker at a Bitcoin conference. It's anomalous. It finally dawned on me, or somebody introduced me to the fact that, wait a minute, it's a transfer mechanism. It's a great way for getting money across borders, better than gold that way, because it can't be gotten by X-ray machines and all that. Okay, so and I jumped into Bitcoin, and I've been buying it since then. Anyway,
Can I just explain the transfer mechanism? Let me just explain one thing about the transfer mechanism, because I think this one example is pretty telling. All the transactions in the blockchain on Bitcoin are transparent. They're viewable. You can see that how much was transferred from one account to another. And so because of that, you get some insights about, what's actually happening. And I have this one example from yesterday where somebody sent $5 billion worth of Bitcoin from one account to another. And the cost of that transaction was $18.52. And who knows if that one account to another, it could have been from, somebody in South Africa to someone in Taiwan. I mean, you don't really know, but I don't know those details, but you do know that try transferring $5 billion for $18 through a bank. Good luck.
Yeah, well, that's after you jump through all kinds of hoops for know your customer and where did you get the money and God and various governmental foreign exchange controls and so forth. And this is the big thing with these cryptocurrencies. It gets rid of the middleman because these giant banks have become dysfunctional. They no longer serve actually very much of a useful purpose. Things like Citibank and Wells Fargo and God knows what. I mean, you don't need any of those if you've got Bitcoin. You can cut out the middleman, and you can move your currency anywhere in the world cheaply. So this whole idea of blocked currencies and currency controls and all that becomes, passé. So yeah, that's the real value of Bitcoin in today's world, I think. And that answers the question. So is Bitcoin money? Yep. It's got all the characteristics of money. It's just a technological advancement, actually, over gold.
You want to just move your camera down a little bit, Doug, because I'm just seeing the top half of your. There we go.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's better. Okay.
People will complain about that. They will. Like, I can't see all of Doug.
I know. I know. No good deed goes unpunished. So I guess we're going to turn this out. Well, we ought to just, everybody likes high quality as opposed to low quality. Okay, that's cool. All right. So I'm a believer in Bitcoin at this point. And am I a believer in they say 8,000 other currencies out there? And I don't know what the use value of many of these others are. We were talking about that off camera the other day. And since I'm not a computer jock, and in fact, I only use my cell phone for emergencies or when I'm traveling or something like that, I'm really not very hip to it. So you think anything else like Monero, for instance, might be able to compete with Bitcoin as a money? Some people believe it will.
Yeah, I think it can compete, but it doesn't have to. One doesn't have to take away from the other. There can be a world just like now where there are multiple currencies across the globe, and some of them, may serve different purposes. And Monero certainly has elements of privacy that just simply do not exist in Bitcoin, and that's very important to some people. So, but it has the same sort of thing with it being scarce and divisible and all of that. So I think Monero certainly is something that's I think is very interesting. I think Ethereum is very interesting. And there's a whole bunch of others though. And, the truth is that a lot of them, and I'm certainly not a blockchain developer. I'm not super sophisticated in this stuff either. But a lot of them just remind me of technology startups. And, it's all about the adoption curve of the technology more than it is thinking of them as equally competing assets, within the same asset class. I think like Ethereum, for instance, is much more like, if you're trying to compare it with commodities, Ethereum is much more like oil, I guess, than whereas Bitcoin is more like gold. And what I mean is Ethereum basically allows you to use the Ethereum network to power these smart contracts. And a lot of the stuff that you talk about with actually in your book, Assassin, with the Paladin network, all these smart contracts that are there. If you haven't read Assassin, I encourage you to read it. It's available on Audible. You can go and buy it there too. But it's powered by these smart contracts, and Ethereum is essentially the oil, the fuel, essentially to process those transactions. And in any case, I think there's lots of other potential in those, but I think, it's like, just like you could invest in lots of other metals. If you were, if you thought the metals complex was interesting, the base case for investing in palladium is totally different than the case for investing in gold. And I think that you get this deep complexity as you go further down the market cap in these different cryptocurrencies. So let's say
that's a good analogy, I think, and a very good point. And of course, now the ladder's going all the way down to Dogecoin, or is it pronounced Dogecoin?
Dogecoin, yeah. Yeah. And the funny thing is that actually is a meme, like as a meme coin. I mean, it was literally made as a joke. And it shows the power. It shows actually one thing I think it shows is that our markets today are just unhinged in every way. That it's not the idea of the traditional investment analysis that you might use to choose whether or not to buy Berkshire or whatever. It just seems like that doesn't have any place in today's markets, and it's much more like gambling or casino operation.
That's exactly right. And actually before, because I knew we were going to talk about Bitcoin today, so I thought about, okay, if we're in a bubble, how does it compare to past financial bubbles in world history? And this should be the subject perhaps for somebody's PhD paper, but when was the first financial bubble in all of world history? That's a question that I'm not sure I've ever heard asked, but the first bubble that I can find easily was the tulip bubble in Holland in 1836. Lasted less than a year, lasted like 6 months.
Can you Can you explain what that was? Can you explain what that was for people who might not have heard about it before? Because it's actually pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, so this was during a time when the Dutch were doing extremely well. For instance, they founded the island of Manhattan, and they were the world's greatest traders, and the Dutch Empire was going everywhere, Indonesia and God knows where else. So there's a lot of money coming into Holland at that time. And so in Turkey, some Dutch traders discovered the existence of tulips, very pretty flowers, brought them back to Holland. Everybody loved them, and started planting them and buying them in different varieties, and it turned into a big financial bubble. Now, I guess the main popular research on that was done by Charles Mackay, who wrote this book, Extraordinary Mass Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And there he describes the tulip bubble in Holland. But subsequently, but here's what's interesting. This was a bubble. Apparently, a lot of research has been done since then. He said that it went a long way towards destroying the Dutch economy. The fact that people were like, there was this one extraordinarily pretty type of tulip bulb that somebody traded his house and a bunch of cows on the farm and all kinds of real wealth for this, tulip bulb. Okay, so why did things get so out of control? So I did a little bit of further digging, and it seems that since there wasn't a Dutch central bank at that point, but there was a lot of wealth flowing into Holland. There are a lot of Dutchmen that have become really wealthy in recent years. And so it was a luxury market. I mean, you could show people how much money and taste you had by buying it. It wasn't so much a monetary phenomenon, it was a wealth phenomenon, which is a different thing because of all the wealth flowing into Holland. So eventually, it got out of control, animal spirits, as they say. And, it's like people building 20,000 square foot houses for themselves to show that they got more money than their neighbor. That was kind of the equivalent. All right, so the bubble burst after 6 months, but apparently the only people that got hurt were the people that had promised to pay somebody for a tulip bulb, and the other guy thought he had the money and he didn't. So somebody was a winner, somebody was a loser, and the value that was thought to be in those tulip bulbs went away, but it was only among the rich people. And some of the research, there were only a few hundred or a few thousand people involved in it. So it wasn't a big deal. It was spectacular, but it wasn't actually as big a deal as they thought. But then, all right, so that's the first bubble in financial history that I can find anyway. So what's the next bubble? And it turns out that it's the Mississippi bubble in France, followed almost the same year by the South Seas bubble in England. And this is where it gets interesting, because the South Sea bubble was promoted by John Law. And, he'd been traveling all around Europe and looking at different monetary and economic systems. So France was in a lot of trouble fighting wars and building Versailles, which was, immensely expensive. I mean, so much of the gold in the national treasury had been frittered on building these giant buildings for Louis XIV. So they had severe financial problems. So he sets up a national bank in France. And at the same time, of course, France had these large holdings in North America, up the Mississippi Valley, basically, which Thomas Jefferson bought from Napoleon 100 years later. So put two and two together. Hey, we can print a lot of money with the national bank, and we can float this company to exploit all the wealth of the Mississippi Valley. and it just got completely out of control. That did filter down to the average guy, but here was the key with it. It was a government monopoly, the French Mississippi Company, and the government was very much involved in it with the National Bank and so forth. So that was a real financial bubble, and I think it was the first one in modern history. And the key here is it was because of fiat currency and the granting of government monopolies, which is what made the Mississippi Company so valuable, because it had a monopoly granted by the government on all this land. And then a year later, more or less, they were almost contemporaneous, you had the South Sea bubble in England, just about the same time, and it was pretty much the same thing. They were factoring British government debt, and the British government gave them a monopoly for trading with South America, mainly taking slaves from Africa to Brazil, but and the rest of South America and the Caribbean. So that became a huge bubble too, with stocks going up and that. But once again, central banking and the grant of a government monopoly were the key in those two great bubbles in world history. And then, so what was the next bubble in world history? Talking about the Bitcoin bubble and whether we have one today. I just think it's interesting to look at the actual historical background of financial bubbles, assuming we're in one today. I think we are, incidentally. Kind of a spoiler alert there. But so the next thing that I came up with was really not much. There must have been something in between what happened 300 years ago. And actually, we're at the 300th anniversary of the Mississippi bubbles and the South Sea bubbles as we speak, 1720, more or less, for both of them, 300 years exactly. So the next thing that I came up with that was a major bubble was the Florida land bubble. I mean, you know, people don't realize that back in 1900 even, not that long ago, actually. I mean, it's probably somebody that was born in 1900 that's still alive someplace. So it's not all that long ago, looked at it from that point of view. Miami only had 10 or 15,000 residents, which is hard to believe. But so it was just an immense bubble where everybody decided they wanted to move to Florida. The weather was good and there was lots of land. And so it worked out well in the end. But following after that, we had the stock market bubble in the US. But here's the interesting thing, is that for the great Florida land bubble, which and the 1929 stock market bubble, we had the US Federal Reserve that was in existence then. And even then, it was printing up a lot more money than there was actual specie, which was in back of those two bubbles before that. So what caused the stock market crash and the collapse of the Florida land bubble, which were more or less contemporaneous too? It was all the money and the interest rate manipulation done by the Federal Reserve. And the next bubble I could come up with after that was the 1968 stock market bubble, which is, and I was around for that. Didn't have any money, but I saw it happening because I was a senior in college. And it was the same thing, where any stock that ended with EX or Onyx, those were the suffixes that you added on to a tech company, as opposed to .com or something today. That was a huge bubble where, you know, these stocks went to unbelievable levels and fell 90% before they went to zero. And okay, so what after that was also central bank driven. Why do I say that? Because 1968 was kind of the height of Lyndon Baines Johnson's, the most corrupt and vulgar president I think we've ever had, his guns and butter program, Vietnam and the war on poverty, both creations of his. So the stock market bubble of 1968 was also done by government and central banks. Now we move on to Japan. they had their huge bubble from 1985 to 1989, same thing. And now we get up to, modern history that everybody remembers, the dot-com bubble of 2000 and the housing bubble of 2008, whatever. And then today, and I gotta say, today, and these later things all have the same causes, printing lots of money. And the money that's been printed in the last 10 years absolutely dwarfs anything that's come before it. And all that money has gone into the financial markets. So we haven't seen that much retail inflation yet, but it's going to happen and on a gigantic scale. So tying this into Bitcoin, stocks have gone to the moon, bonds have gone to the moon with interest rates being depressed. And Bitcoin, a lot of money has gone into Bitcoin. So we got a stock bubble, we got a bond hyper bubble, we got a real estate bubble. The question is, are we in a genuine Bitcoin bubble yet? So now we got to figure out what's Bitcoin really worth relative to all these other financial assets. But we're definitely in a real financial bubble worldwide at this point, especially in the US though.
Yeah. So it seems like, that definitely makes sense. It seems like a big financial bubble. Clearly the bond market, is the big obvious one. And like you said, stock market too. One of the questions is that I have, like, it's all turned into the whole investing is all speculation now. It all seems like it is like what you were talking about, 1968 stock market bubble, where, with EX or ONX, then it did really well. That does remind me of the dot-com boom, and it certainly, seems like that sort of irrational decision making on the part of investors is driving stuff up today, like GameStop, for instance, or Hertz when it announced bankruptcy, that it went way up. That these things that don't make economic sense are happening. But the question is how much bigger can it get? And then there are people who are big time deflationists, and I know you don't like to talk about specific people, but I sent you an email about one of them yesterday. I just said, just curious what you think about their view, because their view is that the bubble will be pierced, and then massive wealth destruction is going to take place, and it's like imminent. And this particular person has been saying this as long as I can remember, by the way. So I don't know. So what do you think about that? And if it's a bubble, then the bubble gets pierced, and do we have, are we at risk of having imminent deflation, if that happens?
Yeah, well, I'm just naturally suspicious of anybody that is so totally certain about one thing happening.
And what month even, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Look, there's a good argument for deflation, and this argument's been going on among people that are interested in economics for, my God, at least since the 1960s that I know of. And the argument for deflation is basically this. It's that all this credit that's been created by the banks, fractional reserve system, it's all credit. If somebody fails to make a payment, then the next guy can't make a payment because it's all leveraged on debt. And so the whole daisy chain can fall apart and deflate. A bond defaults for $1 billion. Where'd the $1 billion go? It's been, dissipated. It's died and gone to money heaven. Stock market, stock crashes, $10 billion market cap goes to zero. Where'd the money go? This is one of these great economic mysteries that nobody seems to be able to figure out. So that's how you have a deflation. And then, the banks failed that have lent money to say, I explained all this in the front of, crisis investing for the rest of the 90s, exactly how a deflation can work. It could happen, except government is so much bigger, it's so much more powerful today. And the Federal Reserve has demonstrated that it will create trillions of new money, keep corporations from failing, keep banks from failing, bail out individuals so they can pay their rent and, throw money at small businesses so they don't have to fire their employees. So that's the last thing they want to have happen is a deflation, because that's what 1929 was all about, a deflation. Can't have that again. So they'll make a different set of mistakes, and we'll have something closer to what happened in Germany in 1923. So yeah, it could happen. I mean, these guys aren't terribly competent, frankly, but I'm betting on inflation, frankly.
Well,
I'm betting on that.
Eventually all bubbles, I mean, the way a bubble ends is basically as it bursts, it's a deflationary effect in any asset, right? I mean, the tulip mania, when the bubble burst on it, it caused a big deflationary effect with those wealthy people, at least limited in those, to those people and to those assets probably. But I mean, I think about the .com boom, when that finally broke, it was just, there was incredible wealth destruction among people who held on to a bunch of these tech stocks. It was just, so that is essentially deflationary, right? When the bubble does burst. So the question is when the bubble bursts more than anything else, right?
Yeah. When is the bubble going to burst? Yeah, that is a, how high can this tree with negative interest rates, which I thought were metaphysically impossible, but negative interest rates are really just a form of taxation, frankly.
Yep.
How high can the stock market go? Can Amazon go from $1 trillion to 2 trillion to 10 trillion? I mean, where's the limit on these things? I mean, if they destroy the currency, maybe there isn't a limit. But yeah, this is the big problem. And, I've said for years, the only thing cheap in the world is actually commodities. And commodities are starting to run now. All of them are starting to run. The meat complex, the grain complex, the metal complex, they're all starting to run now. So once commodities start moving in earnest, which they are, then it starts going to retail inflation figures. And I'm sure the government will try to disguise them as best as it can. I mean, the government wants artificially low inflation figures because, for instance, like Social Security is adjusted to reported inflation. And since Social Security is the largest single expenditure of the US government, they certainly, don't want that high. And of course, interest rates, they've got to pay interest on that 27 or 28, who the hell knows what it is right now. It goes up so much daily at this point. They want low interest rates, but if retail inflation starts running 5, 10%, then forget about zero interest rate policy. People are going to want more, and the government's going to be spending its major expenditure will no longer be Social Security, which will be skyrocketing, but interest on the debt besides. So yeah, we're right at the edge of the precipice. We could have been at the edge of the precipice a number of times in the last 30 years. Should have, could have gone over the edge. Would have been better if it had. If the economy if that had been used as an excuse to restructure the economy, okay. But this time, I think it's out of control. I'm betting it's out of control.
Yeah, it seems like it. So you would think the market, the stock market and bond market, maybe Bitcoin is still so small, in terms of, although its market cap is approaching $1 trillion now, Bitcoin is, but that's still 1/10 the value of, the market cap essentially of gold. So and I'm not even necessarily trying to compare those two, but I'm just for perspective on people, it's, could go up a lot from where it is, I think, on a relative to other assets. But there's some interesting things to me about Bitcoin that make me think that it's not in a bubble yet anymore, or it's less in a bubble than all other financial assets are, I guess. Because and one of them is just simply the fact that it doesn't have all these sophisticated financial instruments built around it. I mean, there are you can get futures contracts around Bitcoin, but that's about it. And so over time they will come. And then this is where all the professional money managers really make all their money, is with these very sophisticated, very exotic instruments, where they can, sort of hedge and get super leveraged on everything. And really they squeeze out the volatility when they do that. Like that's why we see almost no volatility in the stock market. The VIX is crazy low basically all the time now. And yet you see huge volatility in Bitcoin. It seems to me it's because the market, it's much more of a real supply and demand based market as compared to the stock market. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I agree with you. And let's take a look at the numbers. So the maximum number of Bitcoin that can be created is 21 million. And I guess the current number is 18.6 million have been created. And I know we were talking the other day about out of the 18.6 something million that have been created so far, out of the 21 max, how many have been permanently lost in the ways that they can? I mean, nobody knows, obviously.
Millions.
How can we even guess how many people have lost their passwords and the computer is in the junkyard? Who knows what?
You could probably do an estimate of dormant wallets, wallets that have had no activity in 10 years or 8 years, and probably assume with a lot of those that those are just lost. I mean, I have some that's lost. I mean, if I think about how much money, how much of what it's worth today, it actually will make me feel literally nauseous, like sick to my stomach, because it was a lot that I lost a long time ago. So I imagine there's many millions that are lost.
Yeah. Okay. So ultimately, Bitcoin could be worth 50,000. I guess it's 51,000 or something today, you said. So 21 million. Okay. So maybe there's only an 18 million. Who knows? Maybe there's only like 12 million of the things actually traded. I mean, who knows? So that gives it a market cap at 50,000 of about 600, 700 billion, something like that, realistically. And so how does that compare with other stuff? US stocks are worth something on the order of 50 trillion. So that means Bitcoin is like, well, what would that be? That would be about 600. That's like 1.5% of the value of the stock market. And they say that the US housing market is worth about 35 trillion. So Bitcoin is pretty tiny at 600 billion or 700 billion relative to the housing market. And it actually seems like it could be quite cheap because it's so usable. Yeah, I'd make the case that it could go a lot higher. And the other thing is that the big boys have really just started. Just started. Guys like Elon Musk and all that. So they'll be late adopters and they're going to move in. And there's a lot of little people. And I think in the long run, the real action in Bitcoin is going to be in the third world, where 75% of all the people in the world use what you'd call dog shit currencies. I mean, things that have absolutely no value. They're kwaches and pulas and dirhams are worth nothing outside of the country. And they're treated like toilet paper within the country. People trade in dollars and euros instead of the local currency whenever they can. I think a lot of these people, because they all got cell phones now, are going to start going to Bitcoin. And when you've got a couple billion people that get interested in it, that's a lot of buying. I mean, so I think it's going higher.
Yeah, and I think it's, for Americans, it's tough to understand the actual the privilege, I guess, we have with the U.S. dollar being the reserve currency and being able to really move capital more or less freely across borders. But if you imagine, forget about the average person in some of these third world countries, but look at the rich, the people who have real farms, real assets that are in those places, and if they want to mobilize that capital at all, they'd have to most likely sell it, I guess, in the local currency, and then try and be able to get that currency out. It's very difficult. So because all the capital control, so they can have real assets trapped in a nation state and be unable to really utilize those real assets at all because of the simple currency regime that's there. And that Bitcoin unlocks that completely for people. and other crypto.
That's right. It doesn't matter if you're a penniless Nigerian who's trying to get to Europe and everything you got is in some tiny fraction of a Bitcoin on your cell phone, or whether you're a billionaire from God knows where, from Burma, that wants to get his money out of the country. There's no other way you can do it. Bitcoin. So they're all going to go to Bitcoin. Of course, I think the governments of the world are going to try, but especially when they come up with their own cryptocurrency, their own digital currencies, I should say, are going to try to quash Bitcoin because they'll say, well, it's only used by money launderers. Incidentally, nothing wrong with being a money launderer, in my opinion. That's an artificially created crime, but that's a different subject. Or drug dealers. And there's nothing wrong with being a drug dealer.
Well, especially not drug lord, right?
Yeah, exactly. But so I think these governments are going to try to quash it, but they're going to try to quash it at the very time when their own currencies are falling apart.
Right.
So if anything, it's just going to delegitimize governments when they try to do this. It's like during the Mississippi bubble when the French government tried to illegalize gold, which is what ordinary people were using for money if it wasn't for the paper money that they were creating. Yeah, this is going to hopefully it's going to help them destroy themselves when they try to illegalize Bitcoin. Here's a question, a little bit off topic perhaps, but let's say Janet Yellen tries to illegalize Bitcoin in the US, or make it very inconvenient to use. And I guess on our tax returns, I understand, I don't fill my own tax return out for a lot of reasons, but I understand that you have to report Bitcoin ownership on it. Is that true or not? I should have researched it. It'd be hard.
You have to definitely report sales. The IRS came up with regulations around how it should be handled, the profits from sales of Bitcoin. So you do have to report those, but I don't know about just that you have to note owning Bitcoin. I'm not aware of that, but I'm like you. I actually don't do my own tax return either, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, and of course, when you're crossing borders now, I don't doubt that the next question is, do you have more than $10,000 of currency on you? The next question that they'll add on the form is probably going to be, or equivalent in Bitcoin, who knows? But let's suppose this year or next year, the Biden regime passes some draconian rules on Bitcoin, and maybe that would be at about the same time as it tries to confiscate people's guns. Could things explode from just those two angles, if not others?
Well, I think this actually goes to the education thing we talked about yesterday. If we have such an uneducated population that we don't understand our own rights and how to defend them, even if they come for guns, I think most people will roll over. I really do. I think we lack the understanding of our own rights and have the ability or interest in even defending them.
Yeah, that thing about, you can have my gun when you pry it from my cold dead fingers. That's
nice idea.
Yeah, just nice idea, but basically just brave talk that comes out after you've had a couple of drinks, but probably not too realistic. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. But I do think, I think that the more the institutions actually get involved in Bitcoin, the more likely that the regulatory bodies, go at it around the edges. Because, there was BlackRock today talked about the fact their CFO was on CNBC or Bloomberg, I don't recall, talking about the fact that, they say they're dabbling in Bitcoin. So this is the largest money manager in the world, says that they're dabbling in Bitcoin now. I just think the more those guys get involved, the less likely that it's like a blanket ban on it, and much more that they just nibble around the edges about, in order to try and control it and try and corral it, which means there's time. There's time. I wouldn't expect some sweeping legislation tomorrow that says Bitcoin is illegal. I would expect much more regulations that narrow the scope of its use, maybe for a while, or increase the taxes on sales or something. I don't know, but I think there's a lot of room potentially upward from here before any of those things happen.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the amount of U.S. currency in circulation, most of it's $100 bills, but it's said that there's about $1.5 trillion of US paper money, actual currency bills in circulation. So if we take the amount of Bitcoin that we're figuring at 700 billion, the value of Bitcoin is about half what it is for paper US money out there. And they're definitely going to try to get rid of that paper US money. And I think what's going to happen is Bitcoin is going to kind of move into that vacuum. That's another argument for going higher, frankly. It's going to have to replace that $1.5 trillion of paper money used the way it is.
What do you think for people who seen, every time we talk about Bitcoin on here, we get some serious gold bugs that just are, have a violent reaction, almost emotionally violent reaction, at least, to just even the fact that you're talking about it, because you're well known for your, for being associated with precious metals and seeing the value of sound money and seeing how critical that is for an economy. What do you think it is that people who, what is it? What's the mental barrier that keeps people from seeing what you started to see in 2017?
Well, look, I bought my first gold in 1971 or 1972. Didn't have much money, but I could afford a little bit at roughly $42 an ounce back then. And I haven't sold an ounce of it since then. So I've accumulated quite a bit of gold, actually, just buying it and putting it away. And with the exception of blowing out most of my Bitcoin in early January of 2018, and then buying it back, I haven't sold any Bitcoin either. And I don't plan on it at the moment. So look, as far as gold is concerned, you've got to have a lot of gold, and you've got to have silver too. I mean, I just bought a couple thousand ounces of Canadian maple leaf silver rounds about 2 months ago or something like that. They're the last that I bought. And I'll keep buying them. I mean, what else are you going to do with your money? I mean, buy another house, buy 2 or 3 more houses. Those are just liabilities disguised as assets when you get right down to it. So, yeah. Do I want to buy stocks? No, I continue to buy gold. And of course, mainly what I do is I speculate in gold mining stocks. So no, I haven't drunk the Kool-Aid for people out there that think I ought to be pounding the rostrum for gold only. But at this point, yeah, I'm a gold bug, but I've become a Bitcoin bug.
What do you think the mental block is that people have, though? What is it that keeps them, like Peter Schiff is a well-known example of a sound money guy, and he's sound in a lot of his thinking, and yet he is religiously, it seems, against Bitcoin. And
you're right. It's become a religion with Peter. I mean, what is that saying? It's harder to convince somebody. Once you've convinced them of something, it's harder to unconvince them than it is to reconvince them of something totally new, as it were. So for some reason, Peter seems to think that Bitcoin is the enemy of gold. Actually, that's totally untrue, because Bitcoin has introduced huge numbers of people to the idea of that, hey, there's something out there besides the US dollar you can use as money. And now people that own Bitcoin refer to the US dollar as fiat currency. Something they never would have done before.
Right.
I think Bitcoin is actually kind of an entry drug to the gold market, because you want both, quite frankly. And Peter, should really, at this point, start eating his words with a fork and spoon. He's just being pointlessly stubborn. And you put your finger on it. It's a religious thing. It's almost like the people that follow Ayn Rand, of whom I'm a huge fan, as you know. But they take every word that she's written as if it was the Bible. It's a religion. Can't differ from it at all. And it's like that with some people that are in gold and won't look at Bitcoin.
Yeah, I don't.
It's a religious thing.
It is. It does seem that way. Although even Peter said today, he said on Twitter, he said now that Bitcoin has passed $50,000, I can't rule out the possibility that it could go to $100,000. But he said there's also a chance there's just as likely that it goes to zero. So, but he is hedging for the first time, at least. I admitting that this price, the price action, at least, is has momentum of its own and could likely drive higher to 100,000.
Yeah, Peter's a smart guy, but one thing that you should learn about the markets is never say never. Absolutely anything can happen.
Yeah.
And so it's.
Yeah, we're in kind of, and we're like we talked about earlier with the markets today, where it's not based upon sound fundamentals. It's not based upon it's not based upon price to earnings ratios with stocks. It's not based upon real yields, reasonable yields with bonds. I mean, everything is distorted by the Fed, essentially.
We are in Terra Incognita, and now we're just looking at the financial aspects of this thing. But this is actually the biggest thing that's happened since the Industrial Revolution, what's going on right now. Just the financial aspects are scary. We'll get into the economic aspects as they start revealing themselves in the next few years, the huge distortions, and the political aspects. Who knows what's going to happen in Washington, D.C. I'm sure it's going to be even crazier than House of Cards. It already is. And then the military aspects of it, when they launch some kind of a war against China or God knows what else to distract people from domestic problems and unite them. Nothing like a war to unite people. And then ultimately the demographic problems is, the whole culture of the US changes with massive immigration of people that don't have a clue of what made America the place that it was. Yeah, so this is a big deal.
You said
we're just kind of scratching the edges of the surface with what's going on with Bitcoin here.
Yeah. So I don't think I've heard you compare the shifting of the world order essentially to the Industrial Revolution before. So like you're saying that all the different factors that are driving all the changes that we talked about now, that will cause an upheaval essentially that's as significant for people as the Industrial Revolution was.
Yeah, it's exactly. Let's say that the first revolution that we had, big history, worldwide scale. Let's say that was the agricultural revolution, which occurred at the end of the Ice Age, say 10,000 years ago. Okay, and what was the next revolution after that? Well, it was the Industrial Revolution, which was, about 250 years ago, 250 to 100 years ago, more or less. That changed everything. So what's the next revolution that we're going to have? It's maybe it's the entertainment revolution. Maybe as robotics come into their own with artificial intelligence, who knows how it's going to change? I mean, things are accelerating at a hyperbolically accelerating rate. And, that was a ridiculous book that guy Fukuyama, kind of like he's one of the minor priests of the deep state, actually. And he wrote this book about the end of history, which is, why democracy, basically social democracy, was the final stage of history. Well, I thought it was a ridiculous book then. But actually, because of the evolution in technology, and actually Bitcoin is part of it, you might say, the whole nature of life could change here in the future. When the nanotechnic revolution gets underway in earnest, it's actually going to change the whole nature of life itself. I mean, I think unrecognizably. And it's soon. It's soon because of the rate these things are advancing. Even if the economy collapses, I mean, these scientific revolutions, there's enough capital that'll still be concentrated there, and they're advancing quickly enough. So, God, it's going to be really, really interesting seeing what happens over the next 20 or 30 years.
There must have been some point during the Industrial Revolution where, you know, the life of one generation was would have been unrecognizable to the people of the prior generation. I mean, that must have been at some point during the Industrial Revolution. People experienced that, and I guess that we are on the cusp of that now.
Yeah, I'll bet we are actually. It's funny. It's like all of us as individuals are kind of like we're on the world battlefield and we're experiencing the fog of war, or I'm just trying to dodge local bullets and keep my,
Exactly.
you know, yeah, I don't know what's going on the other end of this battlefield. Forget about the other side of the world. I'm sure, there's all kinds of stuff like that.
Yeah.
And, you know, back in, you know, pre-industrial times, things didn't change very quickly. It's like one of my favorite scenes from one of my favorite movies, which is Robin and Marion, starring Sean Connery and Audrey Hepburn, last movie she made. And oh God, he used to play, I'll think of it. Anyway, Robin and Marion, great movie. So anyway, Robin Hood and Little John come back from the Crusades and they walk into this shabby, crappy English village. And Little John looks around and says, God, it's great. It hasn't changed a bit. Like he was approving, having seen the wonders of the Orient. And he sees this crap little falling down villages. It's wonderful. It hasn't changed a bit. So maybe we're like that. You know, we like to hold on with the things that we had when we were kids. Maybe they were better in some ways, but it's all changing right before our very eyes.
It's changing really fast now. It's very interesting. I think I guess the question, you know, what I kind of feel like with what's happening with the markets and investing in Bitcoin right now is that it's almost, because I believe that we're in a bubble, big financial bubble, as you talked about before, but it's almost like a game of chicken, because you want to stay in it enough to get to, like you said, fill up the bag a little more while you can, take advantage of these booming markets. But it does feel like a game of chicken to me, you know, and it's not, you don't know when the music will stop.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But I'm betting the Bitcoin goes higher at this point. And I still don't want any part of the stock market. And I'm actually looking for a place to go short, both big stocks and bonds. But then where do you, of course, you know, the thing is, as nasty as this Greater Depression is going to be, all the real wealth, well, not all, but most of the real wealth in the world will still exist. It's just going to change ownership. I've always said that. So no reason why you shouldn't get a larger share of it, unless Klaus Schwab is right, where he says that by 2030, you'll own nothing, right, and you'll be happy.
Right. And that's something we should talk about later this week or next week again, because there's been a lot of things that have happened since the last time we talked about the Great Reset, and some of the things that are happening now with it, you know, having to do with food production, and, you know, Bill Gates owning so much of it, and Bill Gates coming out the other day. And Bill Gates is such a weird, it's just weird to have his name even come up in this context to me. But, you know, he says advanced nations need to abandon meat altogether, that we have to use some, you know, synthetic meat, and it's just crazy stuff. I think he's a
genuine criminal sociopath. I really believe that. But, you know, talking about what we're going to talk about, I know tomorrow we're going to have Kolya Spori on with us, and people are listening now that are still with us after an hour. Definitely want to tune in tomorrow, because Kolya founded the Extreme Travelers Club. That, you know, he's been everywhere. He knows everybody. He's a fun guy. So people are going to want to tune in tomorrow for sure.
Yeah, he's got a lot to say, and especially about the future of travel for a person who is an extreme traveler. It'd be interesting to get his take on that. And I know he's got a whole bunch of other things that'll be interesting to talk about. So yeah, we'll save that for tomorrow. Thank you very much, Doug. In the current term, we say buy more Bitcoin, I guess, but you know, it's harder to say it today than it was 4 months ago when it was $10,000 and we told people go buy it. It's a lot harder to say.
But I'll still say buy more gold, buy more silver, and get interested in these gold mining stocks. They're the only thing I can think of that's really cheap.
All right, great. We'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Doug. Appreciate it. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
Thanks.